Welcome to the CEC Report for September 20th. I'm Elisa Barwick, and with me today is CEC leader Craig Isherwood. Hi Craig.
Yeah, thanks Elisa.
Today we're going to discuss, as GFC Mark II hits, Glass-Steagall versus bail-in fight is on. Russian intervention short-circuits world war drive for the moment, and do you really want to be the infrastructure Prime Minister, Mr Abbott? Talk to China. So firstly today, as GFC Mark II hits, Glass-Steagall versus bailout fight is on. Now, with the war on the back burner, this has really put the spotlight back onto the banks, and there's no diversion. So there'll definitely be a major escalation for the bail-in drive, which is the ushering in of a policy to steal the deposits of creditors in the banks.
Which no one knows much about in this country at all, Elisa. I mean, from calling a lot of local councillors, you find that this is just not being discussed at all.
No.
That the intention that you have an unelected bureaucracy in the Treasury Department, in APRA, in ASIC and in the Reserve Bank are pushing policies literally to steal people's deposits through this bail-in mechanism is just not being talked about.
No, and we have to bring that into the light because the next phase of the global financial crisis is now being discussed quite openly. We've just had in recent days a number of further warnings to what we've previously reported. Lyndon LaRouche, who's the head of our international organisation, warned on the 16th of September in a radio interview that the system just cannot keep going with the amount of hyperinflation now built into it.
We're talking about this fight that just broke out over this last week, where Bernanke was, posturing, or not him per se, but a lot of media commentators were saying things like, "Oh, look, like they might wind back this quantitative easing by $10 billion." A month, because they're pumping in $85 billion a month into the speculative financial industry. Now, what has happened, of course, is that they put it on hold because this thing is
they can't do it.
They can't do it.
Well, they can't even talk about doing it, actually.
That's the problem.
In fact, that caused jitters here in Australia because a number of hedge funds, PIMCO, etc., started shorting, selling Australian shares in Australian banks, I should say.
To put a real focus on this fragility of the financial system, which in turn, of course, puts a real focus on the need for Glass-Steagall, which is a re-regulation of the banking system where you separate out the legitimate commercial banking system and then you quarantine the merchant and the investment banking side of things. Now, here in Australia, we have 4 too-big-to-fail banks, which are basically huge conglomerates of banking, of merchant banking, speculation, huge derivatives exposure, $21.5 trillion of exposure to derivatives. And the problem we've got is that here in Australia, what Glass-Steagall would mean is, okay, you'd break up those banks. You'd say, okay, you could be a bank, National Australia Bank, you'd be a bank, right? You're going to have deposits and home loans and so forth, that's fine. But all your merchant banking stuff, or your access to foreign derivatives trading, or your share trading, all of that stuff, that's not going to be guaranteed by taxpayers. That's private merchant banking functions. You're not going to be covered by the carte blanche seems to be policy of covering all those sorts of speculative activities.
And this was brought up actually in the Australian media just in recent days following the election, because one of the things on the horizon is that the new government had promised for a while that they would have a new inquiry into the financial system, the so-called Son of Wallace, following the original Wallace inquiry. And actually we wanted to play a clip which was on the ABC Late Line Business on the 12th of September, which discussed that some leading figures are in fact calling for a type of Glass-Steagall regulation, which they refer to in this clip as narrow stream banking.
The main grievance is the dominance of the big 4 banks, which are among the most profitable in the world and together account for 83% of the mortgage market.
We're stuck with a 4 pillars policy with the 4 major banks, and breaking up those oligopolies and creating greater competition would be at the heart of any debate about changing the banking system.
It may very well be the case that having a somewhat more concentrated and less competitive banking sector is good for financial stability, but that's one of the questions that needs to be thought through very carefully.
And within that highly concentrated industry is another layer of concentration. Around 60% of bank lending goes to housing, which critics argue is at the expense of loans to more productive areas of the economy. Some have argued the inquiry should also consider the idea of narrow banking, where government protection is only given to those institutions engaged in deposit taking and lending, as opposed to investment banking.
You want to have very safe utility banks where individuals can invest their deposits and feel very safe, and those funds are used in reasonably safe investments. But you also want to make sure that our financial sector does take risks, takes appropriate risks, is innovative and so on.
So what's driving this, Elisa, is the fact that most of the financial insiders know that there is going to be a second global financial crisis. Nothing has been solved since the first one back in 2007.
Yeah, in fact, leading commentators are saying, look, I'm seeing all the signs similar to what happened before 2008, but worse. For example, you had in an article by Ambrose Evans Pritchard, veteran City of London financial observer, in the 15th September London Telegraph, where he quoted William White, who's the former chief economist of the Bank for International Settlements and also the current bigwig on the OECD's Economic Development and Review Committee. And he said that this looks like, to me, 2007 all over again, but even worse. And even here in Australia, in the 17th September Business Spectator, leading Australian financial commentator Alan Kohler wrote, 5 years later, we're getting more sleep, but the question now is, what, if anything, was learned and has enough been done to prevent the same thing happening again, compared to 2008, as it has periodically through history? The answer is no. It will definitely happen again. But yet these commentators, unlike other international commentators, here in Australia at least, they are still falling short of calling for Glass-Steagall. Now in America, over the last week, there have been a number of further calls, resolutions being passed. Senator Elizabeth Warren, who sponsored a bill for Glass-Steagall in the Senate, gave a fiery speech to the AFL-CIO, which is the main union body, really going after the crimes of Wall Street and calling for Glass-Steagall. That body, the AFL-CIO, passed a resolution calling for Glass-Steagall. The Detroit Board of Education, which we know Detroit is, in hell right now, have passed a resolution in support of Glass-Steagall. The Dallas Federal Reserve President Richard Fisher, who stopped short in the famous June 2013 Financial Services Committee hearing of calling for Glass-Steagall, he now is coming out very openly talking about Glass-Steagall and saying that this is absolutely doable. You've also had a number of bankers, John Reid, the former CEO of Citigroup, who has come out calling for Glass-Steagall, Brian Marshall, who was the banker who administered the bankruptcy of the Lehman Brothers, which is the 5th anniversary, of course, of that bankruptcy in 2008. He's now recommending a global Glass-Steagall banking separation. And in fact, he said, until I saw what happened to Lehman Brothers, I supported the repeal of Glass-Steagall, but now he's changed his mind. But the big news is what's happened in Switzerland, and that is that a motion for Glass-Steagall, which was put forward by 3 opposition parties, it was voted up by 100 votes to 70, so they defeated the governing coalition, and that calls for strict Glass-Steagall type of banking separation, which we've put out a media release on this week. It may not get through because there is, in the end it may not get through because there's not support from the government. They may try to block it. However, there is an additional signature drive to get the 100,000 signatures required to put this up in Switzerland as a referendum, which, when they do pass such referenda in Switzerland, becomes equivalent to an act of parliament, and they would expect to have the support of 60% of voters.
Now, this would be quite ironic, Elisa, given that 25 years ago our organisation was founded on the idea of supporting a drive for citizens to initiate a referendum here in Australia. We since have gone away from that policy, specifically because of the role of the media and the fascist control top-down. But nonetheless, look, what you have is a historical basis for this in Switzerland, whereby the people do have a direct role in determining what their laws are. And if this gets up, it's only indicative of the groundswell of support that people have for Glass-Steagall. And when you start to talk to people in our country about the need to re-regulate the banking system, to break the big banks up, because you need to have a banking system that's financially stable, but also stable from the point of view that it's not governed by all this speculation that's inside it, right? And people agree with that. Well, obviously Glass-Steagall is the way to go. It's the most sane policy on the table right now, and that's what's gaining momentum all over the place.
And I mean, these Swiss would be looking at the rest of Europe thinking, oh my God, we don't want to go the way of Greece or Cyprus or Spain or Italy, etc., etc.
If this resolution gets up, it could bring down the system because of what happens in Switzerland.
Well, exactly, because you have just 2 Swiss banks, which happen to be 2 of the most crucial banks in the world, the UBS and Credit Suisse, which if those 2 banks were forced to go through the separation between their speculative and derivative style investments and the actual deposits, this would have an effect worldwide, because all of these trillions of dollars of speculative liabilities they have would be hung out to dry. And Switzerland functions as the offshore financial centre for all of Europe and a lot for the world as well.
Another really extreme irony is this is a country that's passed the bail-in laws.
Yeah.
So you have a country here that the bankers are eyeing off something $400, $500 billion, something in that vicinity, of the deposits in those banks to convert to shares. So no wonder they're sort of hyped up about overturning those laws and going with other laws like the Glass-Steagall.
And it would become very clear that Glass-Steagall is a workable alternative to bail-in. And just on the bail-in progress, because our regular viewers would know that the G20 was going to be discussing the bail-in in some depth, and it was somewhat overshadowed by the war drive in Syria. However, the G20 leaders' statement was full of material on the bail-in, and I'll just state to you what one of the findings that they did put in their leaders' declaration, and that is, they said that all major jurisdictions, in part or in full, have implemented agreed tools and procedures for the orderly resolution of large, complex financial institutions without taxpayer loss. Without taxpayer loss meaning we're going to bail in the depositors, not do a bailout funded by taxpayers. And they went on to say that we will undertake the necessary actions to remove obstacles to cross-border resolution. So, in effect, they're saying we will do everything that is necessary to get this through. Another interesting thing on this is that when Moody's downgraded the subordinated debt of Australian banks on the 5th of September, the rating agency, they said that this was due to the bail-in risk, because of course subordinated debt, Craig, is what would be bailed in. This is the
this is debt, which is basically, if you have a bank that goes under, then the subordinated debt is on the bottom of the pile. You have, first of all, you have your covered bonds, which is a whole new story. Then you have your depositors. Then you have your secured debt, right? And then you have your subordinated debt. Your secured debt is directly secured against some sort of asset, right? Same as the covered bonds and the depositors' funds. Now, the subordinated debt is just basically they get what's left over. So if you have a lot of bail-in operations take place, that debt is it's on the bottom of the pile.
So this was the basis for downgrading the ratings of major Australian banks. Now, that's all we've got time for in this segment, but after the break we'll be discussing Russian intervention short-circuits world war drive for the moment. Welcome back to the CEC Report. Now we're discussing Russian intervention short-circuits world war drive for the moment. Now, at the proverbial minute to midnight last week, a military intervention into Syria was averted thanks to Russia's intervention, and also to a domestic shift happening in the United States, because basically President Obama at a certain point knew he did not have the numbers to get this through the Congress.
Well, from what I hear, Elisa, his own administration was hounding him, saying, don't push this, you can't push this, we don't have the support. 125 people, before it had even been brought to Congress, had stood up and said, we don't want to go to war, and they only had something like 25 people across the whole Congress that were supporting the war. So he knew that he was a gone bunny on this.
Yeah,
if he tried to push it ahead and so forth.
And it failed to pass through the Congress, even the Senate, he would have been a lame duck.
So what happened when he met with Putin in Russia, this idea of Syria giving up its chemical weapons came up, and then of course Obama saw that as a way out.
Yeah, he took that as the way out. So he was forced to give credibility to Putin, which is hilarious, I think.
Yeah, and it's one thing about chemical weapons, Elisa, they're somewhat obsolete when you're talking about the fact that you're dealing with a nuclear war scenario in the world today. I mean, chemical weapons are horrendous weapons, as as we've seen from what's taken place in the last month or two. And any government that has these weapons to use them in their own people, or even to use them in war, would be immediately discredited, right? They're not conventional weapons. So, in a sense, to give up these chemical weapons by Syria is a very powerful and good move for them, because they're not going to use them, they're not needed, and they send a message that we don't want to. We're cooperating. We don't want to have war. We want to, and there's plenty of evidence, as the Russians have said, that there's plenty of evidence to suggest that the rebels or the opposition are using chemical weapons.
And use them as a deliberate provocation to bring in international intervention.
That's right.
So now there was also a critical intervention of President Putin himself into this debate inside the United States, where he took the unprecedented step of writing an open letter to the American people, which was published on 9th September in the New York Times. And in that open letter, he stated that these strikes would lead to increased violence, more innocent victims, and would unleash a further new wave of terrorism, which is obvious to anyone who's thinking. He told Americans a number of things that they rarely hear. The Syrian government is fighting Al-Qaeda. There's reason to believe chemical weapons were deployed by the rebels, which is what we just mentioned. And he also picked up Obama and Obama's reference in his address to the American people, discussing the American exceptionalism, we have the right to intervene because, we're better type attitude. And Putin said, look, we must not forget that God created us all equal. He went through examples of what has happened to other countries where America has intervened: Iraq, Afghanistan, Libya. I mean, we all see the reports every day of more killings in Iraq. We know what Afghanistan's like. In Libya, you have rolling power cuts. This is a country full of oil, but they've got 5 hours power cuts at a time. They've got water cuts in the cities now. So this is a horrendous situation, which is only going to become much, much worse.
I think also in the recent period we've published, the international organisation through EIR has published a lot about John F. Kennedy and his fight against the British Empire, because we keep talking a lot on this program about the British Empire and the role of the British. When we talk about Americans, like Obama, we're actually talking about British puppets, not the American people. And this idea of American exceptionalism, right, is taken out of context, because America is the only sovereign republic actually that has stood up for the principles of mankind being unique, and unique in the sense it's created with the Imago Dei, that were created in God's image. And when they founded the republic, they founded on this idea that all human beings are sacred and all human beings have this ability to develop themselves.
So Putin's reminding them of their heritage.
And that's right. That's why he's saying, all human beings are created in God's image, or as he says, are created equal. Is a reminder of the higher principle that Obama is actually stomping over all the time on behalf of his British oligarchical empire-based masters.
Well, exactly. And those masters, I wanted to raise the Saudi role, because this has come up in the 28 pages of the 9/11 Commission report, which Obama promised to release, in which he has hidden deliberately, done everything in his power to hide it. But there's been some coverage of this coming out in the American media. The Wall Street Journal on August 25 had an article headlined, "A Veteran Saudi Power Player Works to Build Support to Topple Assad." And they said that Prince Bandar bin Sultan, who's the head of Saudi intelligence now, has been flying in both to the United States and into France. There's been the Saudi ambassador and so forth, that have been lobbying congressmen. There was another report that went even further on Wayne Madson's website, where he talked about Bandar personally putting huge amounts of what he called incentive cash into an American and French shock and awe military strike, or into getting support for such a strike. So the fact that this is being exposed is extremely useful.
And there's plenty more we've said on this on our website,
Yeah,
Lisa. I think we should point people
9/11
to that.
special reports that we've got available that can be purchased. Now, in the next segment, we're going to discuss, do you really want to be the Infrastructure Prime Minister, Mr. Abbott? Welcome back to the CEC Report. Finally today, we're going to discuss, do you really want to be the Infrastructure Prime Minister, Mr. Abbott? Talk to China. Now, during the election, Abbott said he wanted to be the Infrastructure Prime Minister. Now, he has taken a very good first step, which was sacking Tim Flannery, because if you don't get the Greenies out of the way, you're not going to get anything very much done in terms of infrastructure.
Yeah, just to dismantle that whole horror show that's been built up under Labor, yes.
But we're not going to talk about that now. We're going to talk about the fact that China has called for a major initiative for cooperation of countries throughout Central Asia to build the new Silk Road. And this call came on the occasion of the Shanghai Cooperation Organisation Summit, which happened on the September 13th in Bishkek, Kyrgyzstan. But this idea of the new Silk Road, Craig, originally came from the LaRouche movement.
Yeah, that goes back into the late 1990s, 1997. I think Helga Zapp-LaRouche was invited.
96.
96 was it? Okay. She was invited to China to speak on this.
And this was a Chinese government conference held by the Ministry of Science and Technology.
And this came out of an earlier intervention of Lyndon LaRouche's what was called the productive triangle, whereby you took the productive areas of Europe and you spiralled out using high technology, high-speed trains, pipelines and all that sort of thing. But what the idea of the new Silk Road is the same idea, is to use high technology to open up new regions. In the case of China, look, they've got the whole western region of China is vastly underdeveloped. It needs development. They need more water projects for their population. So consequently, there has to be a real focus on infrastructure. And it's interesting, this is a government doing this, right?
Yeah.
This is a government-sponsored program. The problem we have to watch with Abbott, whether he goes with this idea of public-private partnerships, whereby public is excluded and you're allowed private industry into it solely to make money, make profits. If that's what he's got in mind, it's going to fail. And if there's a lot of hypocrisy in governments, they always start talking about infrastructure development during election campaigns, but very few of them, if any, follow through on them, apart from the old Labor.
They don't secure the funding through national banking, which we talk about, which is the only way you can genuinely move ahead with it.
Yeah, that's why our continuing policy from the election is a vital one. First of all, we've got to have the Glass-Steagall banking separations, get rid of the bail-in. Then we've got to run with national banking and have a national bank that creates the credit necessary for large-scale infrastructure development projects. And we've written a lot about what can be done with our country in order to open up the interior through high-speed trains, through nuclear power, water projects and so forth in our publications. And that's the three planks if you want to develop any country.
Yep.
And the good thing about China is that they have this impulse, and they've had this impulse for a long time. The role of government is to develop the infrastructure of their country for the benefit of the people.
Exactly, and we've put out, people can go to our website to find a report, a 21st Century Science and Technology, which is our international journal, a magazine report which talks about the perspective for development of the entire Pacific Basin region. And so Australia really needs to be a part of the cooperation with China. We should have, forget about going to Indonesia as your first trip, Abbott. Go to China, talk to them about this. Let's have jobs and construction and development that we can bring these boat people into the country, put them to work like we did with the Snowy Mountain scheme, and change the entire dynamic of everything.
We'll see where he goes.
Yep, we will very soon. Now, thanks for joining us this week, and we'll be back again at the same time next week with the CEC Report.